Hi, good evening, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming. My name is David Mirhady, and traditionally I would do something like asking people to silence their phones. Is it not working loudly enough? Should I bend down a little bit more? Or raise it up? Our last talk was on March 1st of 2020. And a week later, as you know, everything shut down. So we were very lucky to have that talk. But now it's 4 years have gone by, and we've anxiously looked forward to this talk, and we've been very grateful to Thomas Kuhn for having organized for so many years, and we were all ready to go a year and a half ago, and things were politically just too frantic at the time. Sorry it didn't happen then. In the meantime, though, I should note that some of my siblings are here. My brother Nader, my brother Tom, my sister Susan, and our mother passed away in February of 2021. So right in the midst of COVID, but not from COVID. And I'm glad to say that she lived to be 96 and led a very long and blessed life. And we're very happy for the life that she lived. But I thought that should be marked. Some people may be asking. So our father passed away in January of 2005, so they're united again, and we're pleased in that also. So I just get the job, the evening rolling, and it's my job now to introduce from the Dean's office my colleague Steve Mongrain, who move things along from here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Dear guests, dear Dr. David Mirhady, member of the Mirhady family, and Dr. Golnar Nikpour for this presentation. As a descendant of a French colonizer who occupied a vast territory of the Atikamekw in Quebec, and now as an uninvited guest on BC First Nation land, I would like to acknowledge my privilege as a descendant of settler and recognize the harm that was caused to the original steward of this land. I respectfully acknowledge that SFU is on the Coast Salish territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam First Nation. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of FAS and SFU University to this year's Dr. Ferrehu and Catherine Mirhady Endowed Lecture in Iranian Studies. Dr. Golnar Nikpour, who is an assistant professor at Dartmouth College in the Department of History, is this year distinguished visiting recipient of the Mirhady Endowment Lectureship. For more than 2 decades, the Mirhady Endowment funded unique public lecture on diverse and exciting topics ranging from ancient Iran to the contemporary period, covering issues of epic and modern poetry, revolution, gender surgery, film, political and literacy, unconformity, urban identity, and the politics of pop music, among many other topics. Join me in the deep appreciation for the late Dr. Catherine and Mirhady Mirhady for their generosity and creating this endowment that made those lectures possible. Their generosity and the one of many other in the Iranian community has laid the foundation for building a quality program in Iranian study at Simon Fraser University. Persian language courses have been offered over the last 12 years, and the library continues to receive Farsi language manuscripts. Over the next few years, there's a plan to construct a program in Iranian study at Simon Fraser built on academic excellence and the engagement of the vibrant Iranian community of British Columbia. So I invite you to participate in this vision of Iranian study at SFU. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Kuhn, who from the SFU History Department, who has coordinated this event lectureship in the past. So, Thomas?
Thank you very much, Steve. It is a real pleasure to echo your appreciation of the support of the Mirhady family and the Iranian community. It has been a joy to see the Mirhady Endowed Lecture emerge as one of the fixtures of SFU's outreach initiatives over the past 2 decades. I would also like to thank all those who have helped make this event tonight possible. First and foremost, Jonathan Goodlockson, Rebecca Armstrong, and Ali Mirjad from SFU's Department of History, and last but not least, our graduate facilitators, Asu Jawahiri and Berk Metin, who have really helped us pull this off tonight. For this year's Mirhady Endowed Lectureship, the committee decided to address the important yet really under-researched topic of prisons and practices of incarceration and their role in the making of modern Iranian politics and society from the late Qajar period to the present. It did not take us long to decide to invite Dr. Golnar Nikpour, an assistant professor in Dartmouth College's Department of History, as her work on this aspect of modern Middle East history is truly innovative and groundbreaking. Educated at Barnard College and Columbia University, where she obtained her PhD, Dr. Nikpour has held prestigious appointments as an E.W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and in 2017 and 2018 as Neubauer Junior Research Fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. She has published in influential venues such as the Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Canadian Journal of History, the New York Times, and Jadalia. Dr. Nikpour comes to SFU at a particularly exciting moment in her career, as her book is titled The Incarcerated Modern, Prisons and Public Life in Iran, has just been published with Stanford University Press. Please join me in welcoming this year's distinguished Mirhady Endowed Lecturer, Dr. Golnar Nikpour.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you very much for having me. And I'd like to extend a very hearty thanks in particular to not only everyone who's here tonight, but to Dean Mongrain for his lovely comments, to Jonathan Goodlockson and Catherine Mock for organizing the details of the event and of my travels here, and of course to Dr. Thomas Kuhn and the Simon Fraser Department of History for their invitation, their very generous invitation to join you tonight. And most importantly, I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to the Mirhady family for making this lecture possible, and to David for his lovely comments. It's a real honor to be with you all in Vancouver on such a lovely day. So thank you for taking the time to join. The talk I'm gonna, just let me know if at any point you can't hear me, if I step away or lose contact with the microphone. So the talk I'm going to give this evening is drawn from my recently published book, The Incarcerated Modern, Prisons and Public Life in Iran, which, as Thomas mentioned, is now out on Stanford University Press. It charts the history of Iran as a modern carceral state. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by that, but I'll over the course of the talk, give an overview of the themes, arguments, and archive from my work before we do a Q&A. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. So let's just jump right in. Prisons in Iran have an unhappy global reputation. Even those with only cursory knowledge of contemporary Iranian politics have likely heard accounts of arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions in today's Islamic Republic. For their part, international human rights organizations and Iranian dissidents and expatriates have worked to publicize the prison violence of the Iranian government, publishing memoirs, producing scholarship, engaging in letter writing campaigns, and founding organizations in defense of incarcerated Iranians. Unsurprisingly, a network of sometimes strange political bedfellows has focused on Iran's prisons to name and shame the contemporary Islamic Republic, push for the release of detained Iranians, and in many cases to advocate against the Islamic Republic's continued existence altogether. Now, given this blood-soaked reputation, it might surprise some to learn that the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is, the Iranian government established after the revolution of 1979, has also long used Iran's prisons as proof of its moral and political legitimacy. Now, naturally, the story that Iran's government tells about its prisons looks very different than the one told by its myriad critics. Now, for the Islamic Republic, the 1979 revolution, a major event to which I'll return several times tonight, represents an unequivocal break with the violence of the preceding Pahlavi era and the Pahlavi monarchy led in the years before the revolution by Mohammad Reza Shah, and with the violence and torture endemic to the former Shah's prisons. Reminding Iranians of Iran's pre-revolutionary prisons has become something of a cottage industry for the post-1979 government. Just as downplaying the Islamic Republic's own prison violence is those same officials' typical modus operandi. State-sponsored research institutions and initiatives publish regularly on the topic of torture in monarchic Iran, Pahlavi Iran in particular. Members of the Islamic Republic elite who spent time in the prisons of the monarchy, up to and including leader Ali Khamenei, also continue to trade in tales of their pre-revolutionary detention and torture. So if you go to Khamenei's website, there's different pages for different aspects of his leadership, but there's one dedicated part of the website just for his pre-revolutionary prison memoirs and thoughts on the Shah's prisons. And that's a fairly typical thing for that generation of revolutionary leadership, many of whom had experiences in the prisons of the Shah. In what might be the most physically conspicuous example of this, of the trend that I'm talking about, the Islamic Republic has transformed several pre-revolutionary prisons built in the pre-revolutionary era into museums, repurposing these spaces to affirm the contemporary government's official narrative of pre-revolutionary prison violence, revolutionary struggle, particularly among Islamist and particularly clerical revolutionaries, and post-revolutionary freedom. So this is just one of those prison museums, Qasr Prison Museum in central Tehran. This is a picture I took in 2014. The museum also has these beautiful park grounds now. So when I've gone, typically there's like people taking strolls and eating their lunch. And you have these spaces that have been totally repurposed, and they tell a very different story than the one I'm going to tell tonight. And despite this present-day struggle over the history and meaning of Iranian prisons, Iran's modern prison system has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is this longer history of the modern carceral state in Iran with which my book is centrally concerned. And let me take a moment here to explain just what I mean by carceral, right? So I'll use that word a lot. The talk is titled The Making of the Carceral State. And what I mean by carceral is not only prisons, although prisons are the central component, but also linked systems of policing, surveillance, centralized modern law, punishment, prisons, the whole sort of network of institutions associated with essentially law and order. So in my work, I chart the transformation that Iran makes from a decentralized empire with few imprisoned persons in the late 19th century into a modern nation state with a vast prison network today. Indeed, the number of prisoners held across Iran has steadily increased over the course of the past century. And really, my book is looking at a little more than a century of history, but the last century is when this change really is happening. Now, in the past century, culminating in the era in which, according to the Islamic Republic's Organization of Prisons and National Security Measures, there are now at least 250,000 prisoners in about 270 official prisons, and that's really the change I'm looking at, from having very, very few people in prison to having this fairly robust carceral state. And those numbers, that 250,000 prisoners, is almost certainly and not undercount for reasons I can explain in the Q&A for those who are interested. So in charting these changes, the book asks a few major questions. How and why did this massive transformation happen? How did Iranians come to understand their increasingly surveilled and punished social worlds? How have subsequent Iranian governments touted the benefits of these prisons? What sort of political or social movements emerged in the context of mass incarceration? What sorts of solidarities have those movements demanded? And how do we understand Iran's prison system in the global networks in which they emerged? Now, before I go any further in explicating the arguments of the book, I would like to just explain briefly the temporal range of the project. So the book covers 3 distinct historical periods: the Qajar, the Pahlavi, and the Islamic Republic eras. This chronology covers 2 major revolutionary movements: the Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911, and the aforementioned Islamic Revolution of 1979, as well as 2 coups, 1921 and 1953. And it shows, as I travel across this chronology, that the infrastructure of the modern carceral state has undergirded ideologically quite opposed governments, despite instances of transformative political change. So it's in the Qajar era that we have this decentralized state with few imprisoned persons, and the first sort of efforts at modernizing and centralizing policing and prisons. The Pahlavi era, in which we have legal centralization and the expansion from merely dozens to tens of thousands of incarcerated persons. And of course, again, after the 1979 revolution, further exponential expansion and that 250,000 incarcerated persons number, official number that I quoted just a moment ago. The book has 6 chapters, along with an introduction and conclusion. And I'm not going to read the chapter titles or go over it in great detail, but I do want to just flag a few of the kind of key aspects of how the book is organized. In the Qajar era that I the first era that I put on the board, I start the story in the 1848 to 1896 reign of Nasruddin Shah. In this era, European colonial officers were an increasing presence across Persia and thus increasingly targeted for violence by locals. This in turn led to anxieties about apparent Qajar lawlessness among colonial officers on the one hand and Iranian nationalists and reformist intellectuals on the other. This leads to calls for increased policing, increased sort of standardization in punishment practices, and eventually, in the 1910s, the first small modern prison network to be built in Tehran, in central Tehran, through help from European Europeans stationed in the country. The book then moves on to the three chapters on the Pahlavi period, which is from 1925 to 1979, an era in which modern legal and prison systems are centralized and entrenched. Under Reza Shah, amid the changes wrought by legal centralization, Pahlavi officials start to participate in policing and prison conferences in Europe, building tens of new prisons, and extolling the virtues of their new modern prisons, prison schools, and prison factories. The Pahlavi government starts to talk about prisons as a space in which aberrant criminals, socially sick individuals can be transformed and healed and made into productive citizens, right? So they're presenting their prisons as something positive and productive for the country. But as the chapters on the Pahlavi era note, it's precisely in that era that distinct political movements emerge, challenging the Pahlavi government precisely on their prison policy. So as soon as the first prisons, modern prisons, are built in the 1910s and 20s, and escalatingly so throughout those next decades, political movements emerge challenging the legitimacy and the practices of those prisons. And I have two chapters specifically on this in the late Pahlavi period, movements that really make it clear to a global audience that the Shah is not exactly who he is presented in sort of Euro-American media representations, right? So these two movements, the guerrilla movement of the 1970s and a global human rights movement of the 60s and 70s, have key roles in popularizing the image of Shah as torture globally. The book continues to the post-79 period, during which the carceral state has again expanded, despite a promise by the leader of the 1979 revolutionary movement, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who claimed before the revolution that in a system of true Islamic justice, there would be no need for anyone to be, and this is a quote, for anyone to be imprisoned for even a single day, end quote. Now, we know that that doesn't happen, that the story is a little bit different than what is presented in those pre-revolutionary days by Khomeini. And I go through that history as well in the 5th and 6th chapter. And at the end of the book project, I look at what is happening in the contemporary moment in Iran, where there's sort of two competing efforts. On the one hand, the continued and in fact escalated mass arrests of protesters and dissidents, and continued sort of stories of torture and mass executions on the one hand in order to suppress dissent. And on the other hand, Iran's government has also publicly avowed continuously for the last decade plus the goal of significantly reducing Iran's prison totals. Now, despite these seeming contradictions, I argue, these strategies are linked by the logic of carceral expansion, insofar as they are tied together by the use of new technologies such as ankle monitors, biometric surveillance, and so forth, or what scholars in a different context call prisons by another name. So that's the sort of arc of the story that I'm telling, from the building of the first prisons to this exponential sort of explosion of incarceration over the course of the century, and now this enormous anxiety on the part of Iran's leadership about the fact that these prisoner totals just keep escalating and escalating and escalating. Now that I've shown you the sort of basic contours of the book, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about its key arguments. Now, my first argument is simple. The making of the modern prison system has led to an enduring and elemental transformation in Iranian life in the past century. As such, the book examines key moments in the establishment of the modern prison system. This transformation did not happen in isolation, but was part of a global trend in the era of promoting carceral solutions. That is, again, surveillance, policing, criminalization, punishment, and imprisonment to a host of social issues. sorry, pardon me for a moment, the document that I had loaded has disappeared. Let's hope that it comes back. Sorry, almost there. I'm just reloading it. The internet seemed to die for some reason. Okay. We're back. Thank you for bearing with me. So as I was saying, it is difficult to overstate the changes that the modern carceral system has brought to Iran. For most of Iran's long pre-20th century, forced confinement was rare. Long periods of incarceration were even rarer. I have some images of punishment in the late Qajar era, just as this sort of massive transformation is happening, and I'll share them with you now. This was one of the preferred forms of punishment in the late Qajar era, the public whipping of the soles of the feet. The whipping of the soles of the feet remains quite popular even until the current day. When people were jailed, it looked like this. In the era, the image of these stocks and sort of chains around the neck was quite common in the day. So it's not to say, as these images of, really, this is turn of the 20th century. It's not to say that forced detention didn't exist before the 20th century. And we have images of prisoners who look quite a bit like this as far back as the 1860s, 1870s. But that these jailing spaces were neither systematized, nor were they capable of holding large numbers of people long term. Often they were quite makeshift, or they were transformed spaces that had been used for other reasons, military garrisons, occasionally in smaller villages and towns, just an important person's house. A couple of prisoners would be held there. The prison, then, as we understand it, is a fundamentally modern institution, what historian Frank Decoter in the Chinese context has called a cathedral of modernity, one that has reshaped the fabric of Iranian life. Now, the central argument that I make in the book hinges on what I call the public life of the prison. I use this phrase in two linked senses, the first of which refers to the new public conversations that modern prisons elicited in Iran. The central topics of my book, prisons in Iran, have been subjects of great significance to Iranians themselves. And if there are any Iranians in the room, you probably know this intuitively, that the topic of the modern prison is something that Iranians know and talk about. As soon as plans for those first modern prisons in the 1910s were formulated, Iranians were talking about and writing about these new prisons. After carceral centralization in the 1920s and 30s, Iranians had to learn altogether how not to get arrested and incarcerated and what to do if they were. And this is how I explain it to my students. Think about the fact that as sort of citizens in the modern world, we all know to some extent. If my goal here in my few days in Canada was to go out and get arrested, I assure you it's not. But if it were, I would know how to do it, right? I could go out into the middle of the street and do something that would get me arrested. We learn how to comport ourselves in such a way so as to not be arrested, knowing full well that some of us are more vulnerable to policing and incarceration than others, and that may be along sort of issues of social difference, axes of social difference like race or gender, right? Like people all over the world in the 20th century, Iranians had to learn how to sort of navigate this new carceral system, and they did so through new genres, including prison memoirs, academic criminology, newspaper accounts of crime and punishment, and of course face-to-face interactions with new institutions of policing, surveillance, and incarceration, all of which form parts of the archive of what I study. The modern prison system has also, of course, proven foundational for Iranian political movements. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Iranians have written on, organized political activism around, and produced art and literature contemplating the relationship between power, citizenship, and incarceration. Some of Iran's most important dissident political parties were formed in prisons or published key materials from behind prison walls. It was in the aforementioned Qasr prison that a small group of intellectuals laid the groundwork for the only mass-based party in the history of modern Iran, the Communist Tudeh Party. One of the party's founding members, novelist Bozorg Alavi, later claimed, "Prison for us was truly a school. We learned many things there, not only about social and political matters, but also, well, what didn't we learn? For example, I learned Russian in prison. I learned English in prison. In prison, one read in earnest." In other words, prison was a space in which Alavi and his comrades fully committed to their political lives. The idea of prison as a kind of political or social training ground has carried through from that moment until the contemporary one, as incarcerated dissidents since 1979 have long referred to Evin prison in Tehran as Evin University. From early Iranian Communist Party prison memoirs of the 1920s to the prison communiques of the Islamist Fedayin Islam Party in the 1950s, to the prison art of the 1970s guerrilla movement, to prison writing in today's Islamic Republic, more or less every modern Iranian political movement, party, person has produced work from or about carceral confinement. Incarcerated dissidents have also endeavored to make the inner workings of prisons public knowledge, from hand-drawn maps of Pahlavi-era prisons to digital prison mapping projects in today's Islamic Republic. And this is an image from a guerrilla pamphlet called Asr Amal from 1973. Asr Amal was affiliated with leftist guerrillas at the time, and this was a drawing of the, at then, relatively new Comité Interrogation Center in Tehran. In the same pamphlet, there's drawings of Qasr. Throughout the sort of literature of that period, there's, and I found several hand-drawn maps to Qasr, Evin, the Comité, and interrogation centers at the time, which would have, in that era, this would have been virtually the only way to sort of educate oneself on these institutions. That these movements have called for liberation from the context of imprisonment is, I argue, reflective of the modern prison's public life. Yet the public life of the prison is not simply that which dissident Iranians have said or thought in response to incarceration. I argue that carceral practices have transformed all Iranian social worlds and public life, not just those of the most politically engaged. My argument is not merely that modern carcerality produced new public cultures in Iran, though of course it did, but rather that modern forms of incarceration have shaped the very notion of the public. This is the second, and I would argue more important, sense in which I theorize the public life of the prison in modern Iran. I argue that in drawing, redrawing, and policing the line between the bad criminal and the good citizen, carceral techniques of the modern state have broadly shaped Iranian notions of citizenship, freedom, unfreedom, and nationalized inclusion or exclusion. Let me give you a historical example to make that hopefully make a little more sense. Labeling its expansion of prison factories social work, for instance, the mid-20th century Pahlavi government argued that expanded prisons were necessary to, quote, train and educate deviant Iranians so that they could live nobly, end quote, as productive citizens. From the 1920s and 30s, Pahlavi state officials touted the rehabilitative capabilities of these new prisons. The names of Iran's prisons were changed in the 1960s to reflect this. The Central Prison for Men and Women, Zindan, was changed to penitentiary or a place of repentance for men and women, using the word nedamatgah. Although I should note that the word Zindan itself was essentially sort of introduced into the language really in the 1920s. It's not the major language that's used for incarceration in the era immediately preceding it. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. And some prisons in this era stopped using the word prison altogether and instead called themselves places of counsel, or andarzgah. This project has continued, albeit in different ideological dressing, in today's Islamic Republic, routinely referring to its prisons as virtue training schools, amuzeshgah nikpour. The Islamic Republic has similarly promoted its prisons as a space where sort of aberrant individuals or criminals are turned into ethical modern Islamic citizens. And if you go to the Prisons Organization website of the Islamic Republic, that is the language that they use over and over again, amuzeshgah nikpour, to refer to their carceral institutions. So just as the number of detainees in Iran's prisons, jails, and detention centers has increased, members of both the Pahlavi and later Islamic Republic governments have routinely promised that modern carceral methods would make Iranians safer by imprisoning and reforming criminals into productive citizens. This process has been marked by a turn towards what I, borrowing from a recent tradition of critical prison studies in a global context, call the carceral imagination, or a way of seeing the world in which the sort of mass surveillance, policing, and incarceration of large numbers of people is normalized and viewed as inherent to the project of progress, modernity, legality, and indeed humanity. And really, this is a point that I cannot emphasize enough, that both the pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary governments talk about prisons all the time, but they talk about them as a way to make the country better, to make the country more humane, to make it more modern, to make it more functioning by the rule of law, to make it more progressive, and today, after 1979, to make it more Islamic. Using a multi-genre and multilingual archive from 3 continents and numerous countries, and I'm happy to talk about the research process or my archive in the Q&A, I analyzed the methods by which imprisonment has come to be seen in Iran as a necessary response to a wide host of social issues, and a step towards placing the country among progressive and civilized global nations. And again, that's the language that was routinely used beginning in the 20s and through to the current day. And this brings me to the next key argument of the book, to which I've already gestured. Now, my work is on Iran, but my work also shows that the history of prisons is a fundamentally global history. The architectures, economies, and techniques of modern punishment, as well as people's responses to that punishment, are transnational and linked. Even places today imagined to be politically opposed, like the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States, are quite literally operating from the same carceral blueprints. I look at previously undiscovered connections between places not typically imagined together, such as Mashhad, Iran on the one hand, and Marion, Illinois in the United States on the other. A number of prisons in the contemporary Islamic Republic were built in the 1960s from blueprints of USP Marion in Illinois, now a part of the US federal supermax system. USP Marion was built virtually at the same time as its Iranian counterparts, as both penal systems experimented with confining troubled populations. And the Marian model was actually an extremely important one in this era. Its architecture is sort of sent to a number of American allies at the time. So there are Marian modeled prisons in Iran and Israel and New Zealand, several other locations. But to situate Iran's global prison history in a global framework, I would caution, does not mean the erasure of its historical or local specificity, but rather to better locate and understand that specificity within transnational networks. A brief example might help better situate this dialectic between the local and the global. In today's Islamic Republic, the government has increasingly used new and globally popular technologies like ankle monitors and biometric surveillance, which I mentioned earlier, linking Iran's punishment practices to cutting-edge surveillance and punishment techniques that are popular the world over, that are used by governments, that are used by private companies, that are used virtually everywhere we go. Yet in Iran, this new tech is often used in novel ways, particular to the needs of a modern authoritarian Islamic government. In 2020, the Tehran Morality Police, the police force responsible for the arrest and death of Jina Amini, the young woman whose death launched an uprising in 2022, began using traffic cameras to not only issue tickets for traffic violations, but also to send text message summonses to women for alleged hijab violations. Those who didn't respond, or those who were issued repeat summonses, were told that they were in danger of having their cars impounded. This new policy was a portent of the further expansion of surveillance tech into the world of morality, so-called morality policing. Amid the uprising, law enforcement officials ominously promised an escalation in the use of these new technologies in policing hijab, very much like places that say, okay, police cameras will help mitigate against police violence. That's a big conversation in the US. It was sort of presented, however ominously, that this new tech might help mitigate against those most violent outgrowths of morality policing. The government's investment then in molding what it views as proper modern Islamic citizens is reliant on new carceral technologies that are used to surveil, police, and punish behavior the world over. So to sort of overly dwell in the global, or to overly sort of imagine that we can understand Iran's prisons sort of cut off from those global connections, or that there's something only Iranian or Islamic about them, is to sort of miss these important connections. Now, Iran's modern prison system was global from its outset. I'd like to delve into this into a little bit more detail, because it's really a key sort of way that I work through the argument in the book. Now, Iran's new prisons in the late Qajar period emerged precisely in a context of colonial exploitation, territorial loss, and profound civilizational anxieties on the part of intellectuals about Iran's sort of seemingly slipping status vis-a-vis the European powers. The new Pahlavi government was quick to try to reform its carceral system along European lines as a result of this. In 1925, members of the Iranian police force, which had itself been founded only a few decades prior, traveled to the International Penal and Penitentiary Commission Conference in London. 1925 was the first time an Iranian delegation participated in an IPC conference. Sir Evelyn Ruggles-Breese, British president of the IPC, boasted that the commission was, and this is a quote, a confederation of the most civilized states of the world, working quietly and unostentatiously to introduce a greater humanity to punishment systems. The Iranian delegates went home aiming to expand and reform Iran's prison system along the lines promoted by the commission. Right after Reza Shah comes to power in 1925, he and his Minister of Justice, Ali Akbar Davar, endeavor to reform and centralize the judiciary. And this wholesale centralization happens at the same time as the establishment of an expansive modern prison system. The most famous of these new prisons, again, is our old friend, Qasr prison. And this is an image taken from a postcard that I found when I was doing research in Tehran. The postcard is from the 1930s. And for a look at prisoners in Qasr in this era, we'll go to this image, which shows you that just in a few short decades, remember the image I showed just a couple of slides ago of prisoners in the very end of the Qajar period, still with stocks and chains around their necks and so forth. Well, that starts to change. Uniforms are introduced, this kind of uniforms are introduced in the 1910s and 20s, and the idea of uniformizing prison practice becomes the kind of norm. Now, Pahlavi Iran intended Qasr to be the crown jewel of its new prison system, and it boasts about it as such, proof to the world that it was a civilized modern state. And in fact, I found in my research the American diplomat at the time in the late 1920s, J. Reeves Childs, he's invited to take a tour of Qasr when it first opens to make sure that it is an appropriate setting should an American national ever be held there. Because the Shah in 1928 abrogates capitulations to the foreign powers, meaning that for the first time, foreign nationals would have been tried under Iranian law had they been accused of a crime. In other words, it was important to the Shah for a number of reasons to show that these prisons met international standards. Yet despite the high hopes of the Pahlavi government in this early era, these new prisons would almost immediately become objects of intense scrutiny and criticism, and eventually lead to a revolutionary movement that took prisons as a central site of struggle. So much so that the 1979 revolution has been called by one intellectual the revolution against torture. And yet, as I mentioned above, throughout the Pahlavi period, Iranian prisons were touted by Pahlavi statesmen and scholars in the newly established field of criminology, to which I'll turn in a moment, as progressive reforms to the inhumane and uncivilized punishment systems that existed before Pahlavi rule. The role of the scholarly academy here is extraordinarily key. And it links to the sort of broader argument I've been making about the sort of fundamental globality of the carceral state in Iran. From its inception, the Iranian Academy was linked in complex ways to the project of Pahlavi state modernism. And a lot of those social scientists and criminologists and penologists who are working in that early, in the Pahlavi era are being trained in the European Academy. As historian Sirus Shaikh has noted, the language of the modern sciences and the positivist logic of this discourse was first adopted by members of the Pahlavi elite and the new Iranian middle class as part of the Pahlavi government's, quote, modernist urge to hasten Iran's modernization and improve its administration. In the post-war era, the logic of the social sciences was fully adopted by the Pahlavi elite. Criminology, as well as offshoots criminal psychology and penology, emerged in the middle of the 20th century as distinct fields in this context. This investment in scientific approaches to solving the problem of crime would become crucial to Pahlavi prison reforms, which mobilized technocratic languages from the medical and social sciences to legitimize state institutions and practices. By mid-century, members of law enforcement agencies in Iran, as well as academic criminologists, increasingly promoted Iranian prisons as therapeutic rather than punitive. If prisoners were the patients, these scholars and statesmen would say, then prisons would be the cure. In 1967, for just one example, National Chief of Police Major General Mohsen Mobassar expounded on this philosophy to a meeting of prison officials. Mobassar explained that Iran's prisoners were simply sick people who needed to be treated humanely, and this is a quote, so that they could be cured of their criminal impulses, which were a disease. This is just one example. No less a personage than Queen Farah also spreads this rehabilitative message. In 1968, in a speech to the Institute for the Cooperation and Industry of Prisoners, Farah says, "Most prisoners are capable of reform and cultivation and are regretful of their criminal actions." And the word I'm translating here as cultivation is the word tarbiyat, which has sort of embedded in it both the connotation of, some of you may know, the connotation of kind of discipline on the one hand and education, right? A kind of, it holds all of the tension of saying you're going to educate prisoners while in many cases also sort of using quite violent tactics to do so. The Queen continued in this speech to explain that Pahlavi prisons were spaces where the incarcerated were sent as punishment, not for punishment. So again, this takes on a kind of eerie tone when you think about the fact that it's precisely at this moment, and this is something I write about in other chapters of the book, that there's a serious escalation of practices that would become quite popular in the 70s and even more so in the 80s and until today, of things like forced confessions and so forth. So the idea of cultivation, that tarbiyat, comes to take on a kind of sinister tone. So how did the government of the Pahlavi government present itself as being capable of transforming bad criminals into, so-called bad criminals, into good citizens? The answer was labor. And in the 1940s, increasingly in the 1950s and 60s, it starts to pour money into these new statewide initiatives to expand prison labor system in the Iranian context. It starts to, in some of these cases, use even different neologisms for prisons, including work and training center and so forth, to say that these are not sites where we're punishing people. They're simply sites where we're training them, where we're cultivating them into having new skills. So where does this go? Where does this process of labor go? Oh, and I'd like to show you just one more image, actually, that kind of shows a bit of the logic, the logic of how these institutions are promoting their work. So this is a pamphlet published by this Institute for the Cooperation and Industry of Prisoners, which is one of these sort of state-run initiatives founded in the 1950s to expand prison education, prison labor systems. You see in the cover of this image the ideology that you're getting, the sort of rhetorical move that these institutions are making, where the person goes in as a sort of hunched over prisoner. They've done something to be imprisoned, they go in, and when they walk out, they're new men. They are walking towards the light of enlightenment, they're standing tall, they're looking healthy, they have beautiful heads of hair, and they're moving forward with their lives in productive ways. Now, this wasn't something that was limited to the prisons of the Pahlavi era. And in fact, in my book, I show that precisely this discourse reemerges in the mid-1980s after a period of an extraordinary sort of transformation, ideological sort of purge that happens in the early 80s, where the logic of prisons is taken out of that technocratic frame and put into a kind of carceral utopianism of the early revolutionary era. But then mid-1980s, there's the establishment of the Prisons Organization of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and in the late 1980s, the reemergence of precisely this technocratic language, and not only language, but the technocratic institutions of the Pahlavi period. So what happens is that in the late 1980s, there are these new prison training programs that are started and that prison officials have to go through. So whereas in the very first part of the 1980s, the people in charge of the prison system in Iran are, it's like first a council of 3 clerics, and then even when the prisons organization is founded, its first head is a clerical figure, and the first several, many of the first several heads are clerical figures. Not long after, and including the last several leaders of the prisons organization, they're criminologists. They're trained at criminological schools. They go through a technical training to run prisons, and they're using very much the same language, this rehabilitative language, to say that this is our work, right? What we are doing is training and educating. So, almost done. So as we see in the project, the sort of global logics of criminology become the sort of enduring ones that maintain the logic of how the institution sees itself. And the most eerie sort of example of this that I can give is that in the mid-1990s, in 1995, there's an academic conference that's held at Evin Prison. And incredibly, and it's a 2-day conference, so academics, for the academics in the room, imagine doing something like this. It's held in the site, this notorious prison. It's perhaps most synonymous with the torture and brutality of the contemporary Iranian government. There's a 2-day conference held there, and academics go and they give talks on recidivism and on prisoner health and on prisoner mental health and on how to reduce prisoner numbers. That becomes a really big deal starting in the 1990s and 2000s. And the person who convenes the conference and gives the opening remarks, gives the keynote, I should say, is Asadullah Lajaverdi, the man who's probably most well known as the butcher of Evin, the warden of Evin prison in the 1980s, who had himself been imprisoned under the Shah's government in the era before. So in this moment, we see exactly as I sort of hinted at in the moment with Farah Pahlavi, this strange imbrication of the logic of education, transformation, and rehabilitation with figures who come to be associated, in this case, actually quite directly and quite brutally, with the most sort of sinister implications of what it might mean to try to train and educate and transform a person from a sort of from what the government views as an antisocial element into a socially healthy individual. So I'd like to sort of conclude by gesturing to just one more of the arguments in the book. I think it would help to know something about how I came to this project before I go into this last argument. When I first started this research as a master's student, I was interested, I thought that the project, then a master's thesis, eventually a PhD thesis, and then a book. I thought that it would be a project about political prisoners and their writing. Something that other scholars have written about, to be sure, but still something that I thought would be worth exploring in further detail. Now, as I started doing the research, and for some reasons having to do with the difficulties of doing research on political prisons, but more so because of the sort of what I was finding, I started to see that the majority of people who are incarcerated in the Iranian context are in fact not dissidents, but rather what the subsequent governments have called ordinary prisoners, or zendaniya addi, what I'll call here common law prisoners. So I realized that that had to be a part of the story. But as I was doing the work, I started to see not only that common law prisoners deserve some amount of research and scholarship on the conditions in which they live and the transformations that all Iranians, as I've indicated here, have had to endure, but rather that I would like to suggest, in concluding this talk, that if we come away with kind of the moral or political stakes of the arguments that I'm making, I'd like to suggest that it's not only for the fact that there are simply many more common law prisoners that they deserve some level of scholarly and as well as political engagement. But I'd like to trouble that divide between the so-called political and non-political prisoners altogether. Now, the divide comes from the institutional difference in which they're held. They're typically held in different parts of the prison. Now, of course, neither the Pahlavi nor the Islamic Republic governments call their political prisons political prisons. They call these prisoners security prisoners or national security prisoners, depending on the era. Still, I'd like to suggest that it is an entirely political history, this major transformation that I've charted, right? So if we take seriously the fact that in the 1920s, there are barely 400 people jailed across Tehran, which is where most of the incarcerated people were held at that time. A couple of decades prior, the number would have been much, much smaller. So we have, as I said, dozens of people in jails in the early 20th century, and today, 250,000, maybe 300,000. I mean, they're somewhere in that vicinity. That is a political history, regardless of why and how those people have been incarcerated. But this has moral stakes insofar as I believe, and this is my sort of concluding thought, that in disaggregating between these groups of prisoners and in giving the lion's share of attention to incarcerated dissidents, we miss certain political connections that might help us in a movement for a more just Iran. In the early 2000s, families of incarcerated so-called ordinary prisoners of Tehran were sounding the alarm about a then virtually unknown penal site called Kahrizak. The people who were being held there were being rounded up on routine kind of sweeps of some of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Iran for reasons having to do typically with drug use. Those groups and organizations sounding the alarm rarely, if ever, made the press in the sort of global context, right? And it's not until 2009 when incarcerated dissidents die at Kahrizak that the name of that prison becomes much more well known among prison watchers, even those who follow Iranian politics quite closely. So I'd like to suggest that, in fact, we have to make a sort of, we have to understand the broader carceral context in Iran, not only that of political dissidents, but the broader carceral context as a uniformly sort of political context. And in fact, in the 1980s, Iran is one of several carceral contexts alongside the United States, Brazil, and a few others that massively expands the number of drug-related offenses, minor drug-related offenses for which it is incarcerating people, right? So all of this is a political story, and I'd like to suggest that we sort of start to think about those histories together more often. So it is with that concluding argument that I will end here. And again, thank the Mirhady family, Dr. Kuhn, and SFU, all of you for being here tonight and listening to my talk. Thank you so much.
That must have been me. Okay. so much for your fascinating arguments here. We are starting part 2 of the evening, where we have 20 minutes of Q&A. And I would ask everyone who has a question to line up behind one of the 2 mics in the aisle, and then we will alternate between people in the right and the left aisle to ask their questions and proceed from there.
Good evening, and thank you very much for a very eye-opening research that you've done. As a female, I'm curious, and curious about you as a female who had to do all this research. Were you prevented, banned from finding out about the carceral life of women in the prisons over the years, especially recently? Was there any documentation of what happened to women?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And it's an extremely important question, and one that I do try to address in several places in the book, although it wasn't a focus for my talk tonight. Yeah, so the first dedicated, the transformation for women is perhaps even more stark over the course of this century that I'm tracing than it is for men, insofar as in the pre-20th century Iran, women were, it was extraordinarily infrequent that women be jailed for even a few days. And when they were never, because they couldn't be held in even the few jailing sites where men were held. If they were held, they would be at a local, important local personage's house. They were, of course, there are very famous, quite brutal punishments of women in the attested in the 19th and early 20th century, probably most famously the Babi leader Tahir Qurratul Ain. But yeah, the transformation that happens for women is actually quite stark. There are no dedicated women's prisons in Iran until really just about the middle of the 20th century, but there are, starting in the 1920s and 30s, jailing sites that are held aside for women in police stations and in interrogation centers. So there start to be the first hints of modern policing and incarceration for women in that moment. But even in the 1940s, so I have this image of Qas prison in 1946. This is taken from a book called Come With Me to Prison by a journalist named Hedayatullah Hakim Elahi, who in that book, in the women's prison, the dedicated women's prison in Tehran, he says there are about 60 women. The newspaper accounts from that same time say that it's something like 50 to 60 women. That's the women prisoners of the country for the most part. There might have been a handful more in local jailing facilities, but I would be surprised if there were more than 70 or 80 women in any jailing sites at that time. So that changes fairly dramatically over the course of the next decades. Although to this day, women incarcerated in Iranian prisons is, right now I believe the official number is something like 6,000, 6 to 10, somewhere between 6 and 10,000, depending on what numbers you're looking at. So relative to the population, women are still a much smaller percentage of those who are incarcerated in Iran than men. Having said that, first of all, that number still represents an enormous change. And second of all, women are surveilled and policed in a different way. And as I've said, you don't have to be imprisoned in order to be interfacing with the carceral system, right? So Mahsa Amini is never imprisoned, but she obviously is killed by essentially the wing of the carceral state. So we have to understand that the surveillance of women is a sort of constant presence in the Iranian context. And I give the example of the traffic cameras being used to monitor hijab violations. Hijab violations are a really good example of the sort of impossibility of actually categorizing according to the idea of political and non-political crimes, because a hijab violation to our mind might be, that person might be seen as a political, sort of the victim of a political, sort of political incarceration or political policing, but they're not viewed as security, it's not viewed as a sort of security issue. It's just part of a kind of a world of morality policing that has been built into the sort of legal structure of the contemporary state. What else the other part of your question was whether or not I had a hard time getting at that issue. Well, anything having to do with researching torture, prisons in Iran or elsewhere, but certainly, particularly in Iran, is extraordinarily fraught. And all the more so if you are, all the more so if for women who want to go into spaces that they're not always sort of welcome into. Having said that, when I did this research as a historian, as opposed to as a sort of somebody who works in interviewing what they call human subjects, I wasn't actually going into very many prisons directly, although I did try in a couple of cases. Now, until very recently, there's actually been an enormous amount of that type of human subject research done on prisoners in Iran for the last 20 or 25 years by public health officials and so forth. Recently, that's been curtailed in the last year or two. There's been a kind of effort from the government to suppress independent research that's not being done by their own researchers affiliated directly with the prisons organization. So I did not try to do that kind of research, but I do know that in the last 2 years or so, it has been much more difficult, whether you're a man or woman, to get into prisons and speak to prisoners directly. But yeah, the story of women incarcerated in Iran is actually an important part of the change that I'm trying to draw. And again, I'd like to emphasize again that in the 1940s, the mid-1940s to 1950, we're only talking about a few dozen women who are incarcerated at all, but there is an enormous moral panic about the idea of female criminality that emerges in this moment. All these books are written by social scientists saying, why is there this explosion of female criminality? Why is there this explosion of seeming sin and vice? And part of that has to do with the sort of push and pull of urbanization and modernization that's happening in this era as well. So hopefully that answers some of your questions. This is a huge question, though. So if people have different angles they want to get at it, I'm happy to go into more detail.
Hi, thank you so much for your great talk.
I'm sorry, the aisle here is next. Oh, sorry, sir.
Thank you, Thomas. I'll rely on you to.
Just have a couple of questions. Thank you very much for your talk. It contained very good information. I think when I go back tonight, I'll get your book.
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions. So one idea is that, have you looked at, you mentioned 2 coups in Iran, 1921, when Reza Shah came to power. So the whole country was, after he took over and with the help of the British first, the country was going to be developed along, moving from a feudal society to modes of capitalism, some modernity, but a dictatorship that needed infrastructure, like banking, education, housing, relationships. So prisons, when you have no prisons, when there were feudals controlling the country, now you have to have that. And then, have you looked at in that context as well? And one other thing is that when we look at prisons, of course we have to have the infrastructure. Like in Chile, in 11th of September 73, when there was a coup, they had to put the prisoners in the stadium.
Mm-hmm.
Much more advanced, but also looking at it, you very well mentioned the hypocrisy of the current regime trying to say, oh, we are okay, they were bad, which is really a continuation of that. But the political Islam, the culture has changed only. And one interesting note is that 2 weeks ago we had, for me it is, 2 weeks ago we had the Iranian New Year,
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate all of those comments very much, and thank you for your kind comments on the book. It's always nice to hear that someone's still interested in more after they've heard so much. So, yeah,
Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't want to go.
Oh, no. I will try to answer that in a couple of parts. To say that in the Pahlavi era, you actually get a very similar structure to the narrative that you pick up. The Islamic Republic is saying that, as you said, we are good, they were bad. You can absolutely use that same sort of rhetorical structure for how the Pahlavi government talks about the transformations that they're making to governance and to punishment practices vis-a-vis the Qajar state. And this is something that they take up from constitutionalist historiographical tradition, people like Ahmad Kasravi and so forth, who write about Qajar jailing facilities, what they call dungeons, in extraordinarily stark and brutal terms, to talk about the sort of absolutism of the Qajars and the necessity for modern law. For that historiographical tradition, the efforts have been for a fitful efforts towards modernizing the legal order. And what I'd like to suggest in my work is that process has been done hand in hand with, as you say, the building of these institutions of surveillance and policing and punishment. There is a tendency to imagine sort of the sort of modern legal order without thinking about those things, not only in the Iranian context, where actually I think we're actually much more accustomed to thinking about prisons as part of this modern legal structure, but to think about the sort of advent of the modern carceral state, the modern legal state, as that which comes with this extraordinarily large surveillance system, extraordinarily large policing apparatus, extraordinarily large. And so I trace, to some extent, all of that transformation, going from just tens of police in the early 20th century to tens of thousands just a few decades later to many, many more, and complex sort of policing system today. In the 1960s, the Iranian police force claimed at the time, and this is in the 1960s before the sort of technologies that we have today, that they already had on file 5 million fingerprints from Iranian citizens. So that is an enormous surveillance state built in a very short period of time. That fingerprinting and sort of dossier building is something that started to happen really in the 1910s. So yes, all of this is to say that structure of is to sort of confirm two of the points that you made, that structure of they were bad, we are good, is very much what the Pahlavis come in saying, and very much what the Islamic Republic also comes in saying. And also to say that it's all part of the state-building project, that it is part of centralizing nationalism, that is an effort at making a strong central state that Reza Shah really inaugurates and that continues to the current day. As I said, the country was quite decentralized in the era before and comes to be quite centralized in very short order, beginning in the 1920s and 30s. So yeah, hopefully that starts to get at some of your questions. I don't use the language of, I don't sort of think about exactly, I don't put it exactly in the context of sort of feudalism as such, but I think that there is a kind of resonance in the way that I do talk about that transformation and the way that you're talking about it here tonight. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for the great talk. And I'm sure you dive deeper into this in your book. But I just wanted to know the nature of the cause of this institutionalization and rapid development. We know Reza Shah was a kind of a centralizing and unifying and also modernizing figure as a despot, as an enlightened despot of his time. But were the causes of this heavy funding of the prison complex and the punishment and policing complex that went with it, was it much more of a modernizing nature, or was it political, since his coming to power was violent, and his coming to power also brought a lot of movements that organized because of the coming of power of Reza Shah and his government. So was it a more political cause or a modernizing cause than them was used to punish dissent?
That's a great question. I would say that, in my view, it's not a zero-sum issue. It's not like we can say it's absolutely for one reason and not the other. Having said that, I really emphasize in the book, and I came to really believe this over the course of doing this research. Of course, there are immediate political reasons that Reza Shah is excited about these prisons. In fact, General Major Brigadier, the General Major Brigadier who was in charge of opening Qasr prison was in fact its first prisoner. Like the day after the prison opened, Reza Shah got mad at him and was like, go in there. So yeah, of course, this is used immediately as a way to punish the people that Reza Shah specifically wanted to punish. Having said that, these institutions, when the very first small prison network is built in Tubkhana Square in the 1910s, it's under the aegis of these Swedish officers who come in to sort of reform policing and prison, really policing. The way that it's been written about in the historiography to date is that it's about reforming policing along essentially European lines to make it more efficient, to make it more humane. And to a person, all of these, the law enforcement officials, jurists, legal scholars, statesmen are saying, thank God that they came in and helped us sort of get over the inhumane and barbaric and violent ways in which the Qajar government punished its adversaries, right? These brutal, and in fact they were quite brutal, corporal punishments, right? So all of these academics and statesmen are very much, I believe they genuinely believe that they are, at least in some cases, they genuinely believe that they are transforming the country for the better, and they are interested in the rule of law. This late Qajar era and early Pahlavi era reformists and intellectuals were, as legal historian Hadi Enayat has said, they were legal fetishists. They believed that the making of a centralized modern state would solve this civilizational anxiety that they feel. Why are we falling behind vis-a-vis Europe? Why are we getting territory carved up? That the rule of law will usher in an age of progress. And that's absolutely the language that they're using, but it's also the language that the global prison reformists are using. And the penitentiary model, that language of the penitentiary, the idea of doing penitence, this is a late 19th, early 20th century transformation all over the world. It is very much the difference between what happens in Europe or the US, where prisons are also relatively new, modern prisons are also relatively new, is that those transformations are not happening because the intellectuals feel that they're falling behind. That's the key to sort of to cracking the code of not only what happens in Iran. This is very similar to the story that Decoter tells about China, that historians tell about Latin America, about certain contexts in Asia, less so now in places where there's direct colonial rule, because those prisons emerged for essentially colonial reasons or for labor exploitation and in the African context and so forth. But there is this kind of view that prisons would be part of ushering in an age of law and order. And then the sort of other side of that story, though, is that this idea of prisons as a therapeutic space, that language emerges at precisely the same time that prisons are, very clearly immediately emerge as sites of extraordinary violence. So yeah, I'd like to suggest that that's not a hypocrisy. It's all part of the structure, the foundational structure of the prison. Prison itself was the reform, and that's something that prison scholars, critical prison studies has taught us all over the world. That early prisons saw themselves as reforms against brutality. That doesn't mean that some people like Reza Shah don't also see them as a great space to throw their political adversaries, but they see themselves, the reformists who are really pushing for these changes, see them as positive changes to the social structure.
Thank you so much. Sorry, maybe a follow-up. I don't want to take too much time. Were there different ways of looking at punishment and law and order in that time? Were there different points of view from different maybe groups of scholars that maybe saw a different way of approaching law and order? Or was it like dominated because of its Western,
Yeah, I mean, there were, the opposing view was always, not always, but the opposing view was largely clerical. because the idea of punishment in Islamic law, there's a tradition, a genealogy of scholarship from the sort of Islamic intellectual world that looks very, very different than the than the genealogy of European criminology. But the people who are in charge are not looking at, they might sometimes talk about sort of Persianate ideas of the circle of justice or Islamic ideas of justice, but that's window dressing for the most part. Even those who are directly criticizing the way that Pahlavi prisons function, except for the true dissidents, I'm not talking about revolutionaries, but like people in the kind of intellectual milieu who are critiquing the way that prisons function, like Hedayatollah Hakim Elahi, whose book I have pictured here. He just wants the prisons to be run in a more, like to actually be the rule of law. They more modern, right? To actually have them run in the humane way they're supposed to be, quote unquote, according to these criminological norms. Hopefully that explains.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you for your great talk, and I think you touched this to the answer to the previous question, but I just want you to delve into it like in detail. If you did some research about that, I wanted to see, I wonder, because you said it's a part of modernizing Iran, like prisons and carceral system in Iran is a part of modernizing Iran. But after 1979 revolution, because it was an Islamic revolution, so people in charge authorities, they wanted to they wanted to rule based on Sharia law. And I wanted to see if you looked into how they integrated Sharia law in this modern system, this modern law system or not. Have you looked into it?
Yeah, of course. So that's a very important question. Let me just briefly take us back to this chapter to tell you which chapter it's in. So in chapter 5 of the book, making an example, carceral utopianism and prison expansion in revolutionary Iran, I talk about what happens in the immediate aftermath of the 1979 revolution. And as you mentioned, there is this concerted effort, albeit fitful and actually to date incomplete, to create a modern legal code that is entirely sort of drawn from Sharia, if not entirely drawn from Sharia, then at least entirely Sharia compliant, right? I say it's an incomplete project because this is an impossibility. And it's one that the new sort of juridical structure runs into right away. Sharia doesn't function the way that modern law functions historically, so this is a sort of long-standing tension in the legal structure. The legal code remains, the overwhelming majority of legal codes on the books are ones that are drawn from the pre-revolutionary legal code. Having said that, there is a concerted effort to Islamicize everything, including firing all the sort of secular jurists and bringing on clerical jurists in their stead, and trying to conform legal norms to, as you say, to Sharia. Now, one interesting thing is that prisons are not themselves, they don't exist in Sharia. Sharia is not opposed to them as such, and there are sort of jailing facilities attested in Islamic history before the modern era, but it's not a conventional form of sort of Shadi punishment practices. The use of prisons in the Islamic Republic, like so much else legally, is massaged by the use of this concept of exigency. The needs of the government essentially come first. The sort of legal needs of the state come first, and thus you can use prisons. They're because they're not opposed to, Sharia doesn't oppose them, that they're fine. But interestingly, you have this tension where these sort of clerical legal theorists who have long said that you don't need prisons, that you can have simple punishments, things like true Sharia punishments for certain crimes, and you can de-bureaucratize Iran. None of that happens. They talk again and again and again about the need to de-bureaucratize Iran, and the bureaucracy only expands, the state only expands. So this is a tension I look at in that chapter. And I say that in the first several years after the revolution, the prisons expand very quickly, and that this moment is marked by what I call carceral utopianism, the idea that if you incarcerate and indeed execute thousands upon thousands of people, that then all of the bad people will have been eliminated, and you'll get to a point where you may not need those spaces in quite the same way anymore. That narrative shifts, especially for things like drug use. Again, I'm thinking not just of dissidents, but the majority of people who are incarcerated. It shifts when it precisely becomes clear that that's not happening, that the number of incarcerated persons is only expanding exponentially. So again, part of the story is Sharia and the way that gets married to these modern institutions. And part of it is essentially a kind of revolutionary fervor that takes the place of that there are these several years where the sort of revolutionary ethos becomes the primary driver of who's being punished. And that again sort of falls into these technocratic, then sort of gives way back to these technocratic practices in the late 80s.
Last question. Matt.
Good evening. My question kind of dives into chapter 6. It caught my eye. Sorry. My question kind of dives into chapter 6, which caught my eye. I was wondering if your research had led you to how political prisoners or even common prisoners are tried and how they are judged and how it's decided what the appropriate punishment for them becomes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, I would say that the trial process is not the central sort of what I centrally look at in my work. There's some great legal scholarship out there, sort of legal anthropology, folks like Arzu Gosanu, who are looking at sort of differences between Iranian legal structures and ones in the Euro-American context, and concepts of mercy and justice that are baked into the legal structure in a way that is quite particular. But what I look at in that chapter is the way that the government increasingly starts to see prisons, and this goes to the earlier question, the question just before yours as well to some extent, starts to see prisons as representing a kind of crisis. There is other scholarship that I lean on, including the work of your colleague Nazanin Shahrovni, who talks about the Islamic Republic having to transform into a problem-solving machine. And they start to see their prisons as a problem. There's too many people in these prisons. We are spending too much money. There's diseases running rampant. There's hundreds of thousands of people incarcerated. And yet, prisons are not particularly drawn from the tradition of Islamic Sharia. Is there any way that we can sort of change how we're dealing with those whom we arrest? So to your question, there was a major reform effort in the last several years from some of the most conservative members of the juridical establishment to make there be more sort of lenient, or to give more leniency in cases where the accused were accused of less, sort of minor crimes or sort of nonviolent crimes, to not hold them on bail, to release people pre-trial more quickly, to actually try to empty the prisons as much as possible. And again, this has something to do with the sort of expansion of disease in prisons. There's a public health need to have fewer people incarcerated. So because prisons are not particularly drawn from a Sharia tradition, there's been more of a willingness to sort of push through what look like liberal reforms, to have fewer people incarcerated. And yet, there's also in those reform efforts, efforts to then have those people punished in ways that might look quite illiberal to us, things like flogging or the kinds of corporal punishment that are more popular in Sharia. So the sort of answer to your question is that the entire structure of how the arrested person is dealt with by the government, whether they're arrested for a minor offense or whether they're dissident is, there's so many different layers and factors to what goes into that. At the highest level of those who are considered some of the most visible dissidents are treated quite differently than a sort of ordinary person on the street who might be arrested for a kind of minor offense, minor drug offense, or some such thing. But there are these major reform efforts to have fewer people in prisons, but then more people on things like ankle monitors, having certain kinds of surveillance placed on their sort of day-to-day lives, public surveillance of these spaces, and efforts to sort of carceralize the public sphere in novel ways. So again, that doesn't, I think, totally answer your question, and in part that's because the sort of entire legal edifice is quite complex. It would be difficult to get through. But yeah, that's sort of the best I have for that one.
Dr. Nikpour, thank you so much again for your great talk. And to all of you, many thanks for coming, many thanks for participating. And I invite you all to continue the conversation outside at our reception. Thank you very much. Terrific. I have many questions.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for those technical issues in the middle. I felt it's a kind of lonely feeling.
We've all been there.